Hi, this is Don Forsyth speaking to you again of group and group dynamics. Today's topic is intergroup relations. Our analysis of groups has reminded us again and again of the significance of groups in our lives. Groups are the great producers of services, commodities, resources. They're the builders, the makers, the doers. When a decision is an important one, we usually ask a group to make that final choice. In groups, we find others who appreciate and value us. Groups support us in difficult times. In groups, we find evidence of our self-worth and protection from threat, loneliness, and despair. For most of us, groups are the secret source of our well-being. Yet groups are also the source of much of the world's discord. In earlier presentations, we learned about intragroup conflict, how the members of groups often find themselves at odds with one another, and so that once pleasant, productive group becomes one filled with dissatisfaction and unhappy group members. But in our tendency to join with others in groups, there's also the seeds of another type of conflict, intergroup conflict, conflict between groups. Across times and contexts, much of the world's greatest and most tragic conflicts have occurred when one group has come into contact with another group. Chapter 14 in Group Dynamics is titled Intergroup Relations, but it could have just been easily titled Intergroup Conflict, for relations between groups are rarely peaceful ones. As a social species that seeks out connections with others, we also seem to have the great capacity to mete out enmity when we confront another person who is a member of some other group. Our intergroup relations are more often contentious ones rather than harmonious ones. Examples of groups that find themselves in conflict are not exactly hard to find. Catholics and Protestants harm each other in Northern Ireland. Members of one class of people enact political policies that benefit their own group and make worse the living conditions for other groups. African Americans and Anglo Americans often express negative views of one another. The French sometimes consider Americans to be uncivilized. But the case study chosen for this chapter is a relatively simple example of intergroup conflict. The Robbers Cave experiment, conducted in the 1950s by husband and wife team Mustafa and Carolyn Sheriff and their colleagues O.J. Harvey, Jack White, and Bill Hood. The researchers' plans for the Robbers Cave worked quite well. They brought two groups of young boys together to a camp located in Oklahoma. They had those groups work together collectively, each group separated until structures came into existence, leaders emerged, norms developed. The groups went through the traditional stages of forming, storming a little bit, and developing norms and becoming productive. And then they brought those two groups into contact with one another in a series of competitions. The researchers wished to simulate some of the conditions necessary to create conflict, and in some ways their plan worked all too well. In just 2 weeks, they created full-fledged war in miniature, a kind of Lord of the Flies, if you will, between the Rattlers and the Eagles, complete with violent schemes, arming themselves with homemade weapons, hostile words, mistreatment, outgroup rejection. They started with brand new groups that had no history of rivalry. And yet, very quickly, they were able to create conflict between these groups. We'll use this particular case as an example of groups in conflict and look within it to identify the causes of group conflict. And that list includes competition, discontinuity, power, aggression, norms, and evolution. In subsequent presentations, we'll talk about the processes which occur within groups that increase the tendency for one group to reject another group. And then, ending on a more optimistic note, we will turn to the question of how intergroup conflicts can be resolved. But our first topic are the causes of intergroup conflict. And in many cases, these causes are similar to the causes of conflicts which occur between individual members of the group. And if you will recall that it's competition between people, competition for scarce resources is what often causes conflicts to escalate. The realistic group conflict theory, as it's sometimes described, assumes that conflict occurs because one group wishes to extract certain resources, and its goals are basically two. First, acquire the resources for my group. Second, take steps to make certain that other group does not acquire those resources. This basic approach assumes that groups would they prefer to be haves rather than have-nots. And so they rise up and take steps to prevent the other group from reaching its goals. Groups often compete economically as they seek out resources through manufacturing and trade, but they can sometimes extract resources without producing themselves if they take it from others. Theorists in many different fields have invoked realistic group conflict to describe such things as clashes between different classes of a society, rebellions, international warfare, racism, religious persecutions, and tribal rivalries in Africa as well. The discontinuity effect, competition between groups, is sometimes much more intense than competition between single individuals. And this is called by Insko and his colleagues the discontinuity effect. It is the idea that groups are uniquely competitive compared to individuals. You possibly could take two individuals who, if, for example, they played a competitive game, such as the prisoner's dilemma game, pictured here, where they could make choices of either cooperation or to defect from cooperation. And if both players make cooperative choices, both sides win. However, if one side defects and makes that choice, they maximize their profit and minimize the profit gained by the other party. As we've seen in our earlier analysis, when individuals play this game against other individuals, they often compete. But when groups play this game, enact this simulation against other groups, they are far more likely to compete rather than to cooperate. The factors that apparently combine to create this discontinuity effect include greed, as a kind of a polarization or risky shift. Individuals move in the direction of greater greed when they're in groups. They also feel as that they cannot be as easily identified as individuals when they're in groups, and therefore singled out for retribution. Also very similar, as they feel somewhat less responsible when they're part of a group making a collective decision to compete against another group. Fear also plays a factor. The basic point that individuals fear groups more than single individuals. If you encounter someone and wonder if they will do harm to you, your belief that that harm will be greater and more likely increases if it's a group of individuals rather than a single individuals. Insko and their colleagues verified that in one particular study where they found that, for example, when one individual competes against another individual, they are competitive less than 10% of the time, but when a group competes against a group, competition increases to 40% of the time. These varying conditions are, for example, when a group competes against one, they become more competitive. Interactions between groups sometimes result in the desire for one group to achieve power and domination over the other group. In some cases, this domination might be purely economic, whereas one country is wealthier than another country. One country perhaps manufactures products that another country desires, and so one country becomes more powerful than another through economic exploitation. However, in some cases, one country will dominate another country through military, coercive interventions. Chuck Insko in his laboratory studies of microsocieties, where he brings people into a laboratory situation and simulates these levels of interactions, finds that group members, if they find themselves in a situation where they are able to extract another group's resources unfairly, they're quite likely to use that power to extract those resources and, in consequence, become less productive themselves. Social dominance theory is a current theory that explains individual differences in the tendency to think, to adopt an ideology which supports power and domination over other groups. Developed by Sedanius and Pareto, some of the items from this measure of social dominance orientation include: if certain groups of people stayed in their place, we would have fewer problems. And in contrast, the more positive, lower items which indicate less acceptance of a social dominance orientation would be: we should do what we can to equalize conditions for groups, or we should increase social equality. But researchers do find that individuals who are higher in social dominance orientation, when in a group context, tend to favor their group more and to assume that taking steps which disadvantage an outgroup are fair steps to take and are justified. And sometimes conflict between groups can be explained as a group level example of the frustration-aggression connection. Very early investigations of why one individual might aggress against another individual recognize that aggression is often preceded by some sort of frustrating circumstance, so that if a person is unable to achieve their goals, that creates a readiness to engage in aggressive behavior. And if cues in the situation are present signaling that aggression is appropriate, then aggression becomes quite likely. Studies do suggest that the same kind of frustration-aggression process occurs at the group level, where a group might experience negative circumstances, it's thwarted in reaching its goals, or it loses its resources, or experiences a failure of some type. And that might be aroused with negative thoughts which serve as cues for an aggressive response, and they take aggressive actions against Group B. But Group B is in a similar circumstance. They have been the target of an aversive situational circumstance, aggression from Group A, and that likely will be paired with negative thoughts and emotions about Group A, and as a result will trigger aggression, which in turn causes Group A to continue its aggressive actions, resulting in a spiral of negative intergroup hostility, which is repeatedly sustained by this recurring cycle. And in some cases, the cycle is broken in not necessarily a particularly positive way if Group B is unable to aggress against Group A because Group A is highly dominant, or can inflict even greater suffering on B than B can inflict on A. Group B may turn to a third group, an innocent and an uninvolved group, and aggress against that group, resulting in scapegoating processes. Normative factors also can be implicated, playing a role in the creation of intergroup conflict. As mentioned in our previous analysis of conflict within groups, the norm of reciprocity suggests that we should do positive things for other people who do positive things for us, but the norm of reciprocity also sustains conflict against each other. The Hatfields and McCoys pictured here is a classic example of frontier conflict where two groups, two clans, the Hatfields and the McCoys, had a whole series of negative exchanges, resulting in loss of life over time. So that if a Hatfield might injure a McCoy might feel completely justified in injuring a Hatfield, and this conflict escalated over time. Conflict aggression against other groups is sometimes recognized as a fully appropriate means of settling disputes in some cultures. Napoleon Chagnon's study of the Anonimo, which in his earlier works he referred to them as the fierce people, suggested that these individuals, indigenous groups living in South America, In relatively small groups, villages of between typically 100 to 250 inhabitants. These villages are communities in and of themselves, but they live in a state of tension with regards to their connections with other nearby communities. And oftentimes, one community would attack and remove the resources of another community. And that was fairly typical of living in the United culture. Culture of honor, it's sometimes suggested that certain portions of the United States had developed a culture where particularly the males of those regions feel as though their honor must be defended. For example, in southern regions of the United States, if an individual is insulted by someone else, they feel as though they must redress that insult in some way, usually by violence. It also means that at the group level, if one's community is insulted by an individual who is from another community or another region, then that insult should be answered violently. Also, norms can develop within groups that sustain violence, aggression, acts of harm, sometimes against one's own group members, but often against other groups as well. So, gangs, fraternities, sports teams, and so on sometimes develop norms which condone or even encourage aggression against other groups. A final factor to take into account when trying to explain the sources of intergroup conflict would be evolutionary perspectives. Philosophers and historians such as Hobbes and Rousseau often debated whether or not people are by nature violent or by nature peaceful, with Hobbes suggesting that without civilization, which structures our lives and puts constraints upon each one of us, without civilization's laws and guidance, that each one of us, our lives would be relatively nasty, brutish, and short. Rousseau was much more optimistic and believed that if we were able to live without the corrupting effects of modern civilization, our lives would be more noble and more peaceful. Researchers have been able to identify some human societies that are relatively peaceful, but in many cases these are isolated societies, ones which do not have frequent contact with other groups. So it does look as though intergroup conflict situations are very naturally intergroup contact situations very naturally turn into intergroup conflict situations. Some evolutionary psychologists have even suggested that perhaps it's our group tendency which provided us with which such resources and sustained us in extremely difficult times, and perhaps were the key, in fact, to our survival and evolution into the species with its characteristics we see today. That those evolutionary pressures didn't just favor joining together with others in groups, but also protecting ourselves from other groups that we encountered. So the tendency to favor our own group and to inflict violence on other groups may have actually created greater in-group cohesiveness. Some partial evidence of this effect is that intergroup rejection is stronger for male members of the outgroup rather than females who are members of the outgroup. The idea being that much in earlier times, much of the violence and hostility between groups was perpetrated in all likelihood by men rather than by women. Those are some of the causes of conflict that we've identified in this presentation. In my next presentation, I will turn to an analysis of intergroup bias and the psychological processes that occur when one group confronts another group. Thank you as always for joining me in this analysis of group dynamics.